moving into the muscles that move the wrist, hands, and fingers. Now, a few things about the muscles of the forearm. When we start talking about the muscles of the forearm, pretty much any of the muscles that start with the term flexor are going to be found on the anterior side of the forearm. Pretty much any term that starts with the term extensor is found back on the posterior side of the forearm. So keep that in mind as you start thinking about the muscles. Flexors of the forearm are on the anterior surface. Extensors are on the posterior surface. So the first muscle up, flexor carpi radialis. Now, flexor carpi radialis. Flexor tells us anterior side. Looking at radialis means on the radial or thumb side. This muscle right here with this tendon is the flexor carpi radialis. For a little bit of orientation, this muscle is brachioradialis. This muscle is pronator teres. So this one right here is our flexor carpi radialis. Now the flexor carpi radialis has two actions to note, or two primary actions at least. One action is going to be flexion of the wrist. So flexor carpi radialis causes flexion of the wrist. A second action is going to be wrist abduction. So abduction. So that means this one muscle can cause both flexion and abduction, abduction of the wrist. If we move from the flexor carpi radialis over right here, this next one down is going to be Palmaris longus. So this is Palmaris longus. Palmaris longus is going to cause a little bit of wrist flexion, so weak flexor, but primarily it's going to tense the skin and the fascia of the hand. So as your hand is moving, the palmaris longus muscle is tensing the skin and the fascia of the palm of your hand. Then we have the flexor carpi ulnaris. So here we have flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus. The one on the bottom, so if we turn this a little bit, this one coming around is the flexor carpi ulnaris. Now flexor carpi ulnaris will have again flexion of the wrist, but now it's going to be antagonistic to the flexor carpi radialis in that the flexor carpi ulnaris can cause adduction, a deduction of the wrist. So the flexor carpi ulnaris can cause both flexion of the wrist and adduction of the wrist, a deduction of the wrist. The flexor digitorum superficialis is a little bit deeper than these superficial muscles. So if you take this section off, so we're pulling off flexor carpi radialis and palmaris longus are all coming off. The muscle you see down below that, right here, this muscle is going to be your flexor digitorum superficial. Now the flexor digitorum superficial is going to cause an action of wrist flexion, and it also causes the middle phalanges of fingers 2 through 5 to flex. So we're moving our wrist as in wrist flexion, but also flexion of the middle phalanges of fingers 2 through 5. Now if we go deep to the flexor digitorum superficialis, so we pull that off, you're then going to see the muscles that are next layer down. The flexor digitorum profundus is this muscle you're seeing under the yellow and the red here, so under the nerves and arteries. This is your flexor digitorum profundus. Now the flexor digitorum profundus is going to allow for flexion of the distal interphalangeal joints. Well, the distal interphalangeal joints are basically the last knuckle of your fingers. It's right towards the end. So flexion of the distal interphalangeal joints. Now from there, we can move on to the flexor pollicis longus. Same layer, but now we're on the thumb side. The flexor pollicis longus. The action of the flexor pollicis longus is flexes the distal phalanx of the thumb. Because pollicis, think pollex, thumb. So the flexor pollicis longus flexes the distal interphalangeal joint. Now by turning the arms, we're looking more at the posterior side here. We can start looking into the extensors of the forearm. For orientation, this muscle coming down around is the brachioradialis. To look at the extensor carpi radialis longus and extensor carpi radialis brevis, we're looking at the two muscles that are right next to it. This one right here, right next to the brachioradialis. This is the extensor carpi radialis longus. It has a longer tendon. While this one is the extensor carpi radialis brevis, a shorter tendon. Now both of these muscles, thankfully, are sharing a similar action. The extensor carpi radialis longus and extensor carpi radialis brevis both can extend the wrist. But they both also can help out with abduction, abduction of the wrist. So that means the extensor carpi radialis longus and extensor carpi radialis brevis both are causing abduction of the wrist, just like flexor carpi radialis. So for that action, abduction of the wrist, those two are synergistic. But now if we think about the flexion extension, the extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis are antagonistic to the flexor carpi radialis. Now looking from a true posterior view, we have our extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis brevis. But then the next muscle over is extensor digitorum. Now this muscle, extensor digitorum, is going to have an origin of the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. So we're coming up with the origin being up in here, the lateral epicondyle. Its insertion is to go down into the distal phalanges of fingers 2 through 5. So you can follow this down, follow the tendons, start to branch off into the fingers. The action of extensor digitorum is going to be extension of fingers 2 through 5. With the innervation being the posterior interosseous nerve. The posterior interosseous nerve. It's actually a branch from the radial nerve. Now if we continue on right here, this is our extensor carpi ulnaris. You can see the extensor carpi ulnaris comes right down the posterior side. If I turn this just a little bit, you can see the flexor carpi ulnaris. But this extensor carpi ulnaris is going to allow for extension of the wrist, but it's also allowing for adduction of the wrist. That means if we're talking about the action of adduction of the wrist, the flexor carpi ulnaris, as well as the extensor carpi ulnaris. So the flexor and extensor carpi ulnaris are going to be synergistic for the adduction of the wrist. But then, because one's a flexor, one's an extensor, they're antagonistic for flexion extension. Our next muscle is going to be a deeper muscle. Now, because it is on the deeper side, we cannot see it in the model we've been using. So we're moving into this figure here. This muscle right here is the extensor indicus. Now, the extensor indicus, you can see how the tendon is going to run right up through here. So just like the name sounds and implies, the extensor indicus will extend the index finger. So extensor indicus extends index finger. The extensor pollicis longus muscle is a deeper muscle. We can at least see the tendon right here coming out and running to the thumb. So this is the tendon, all the way back to there, and then it runs underneath. The tendon of the extensor pollicis longus. While we were able to see the tendon of the extensor pollicis longus, we couldn't really see the entire muscle belly. So by looking into this diagram, which has a deeper view, you can see this muscle right here is your extensor pollicis longus. So we saw this tendon on the model, but now we can see the entire muscle belly, extensor pollicis longus. And to give a little orientation, this muscle right next to it is the extensor indicus. So this is your extensor pollicis longus. Now the action of extensor pollicis longus, well, the action is going to be extends the thumb. Makes sense. Extensor pollicis longus extends the thumb. Next muscle up is the abductor, abductor pollicis longus. The abductor pollicis longus is this muscle right here. Now these are two muscles. This is the brevis, this is the longus. Abductor pollicis longus. And again, the tendon comes right up and runs right into the thumb. The abductor, so abductor pollicis longus, is going to abduct or abduct the thumb, but can also help to extend the thumb. The abductor pollicis longus. So now that we've turned the model around a little bit, we're looking at the anterior side of the hand. This is the palm side. We have our thenar muscles group. This is our thenar muscles group. It's pretty much the muscles in the ball of the thumb. Now there are several different muscles there, and they all have their own individual actions. But as a whole, the thenar muscle group really controls quite a bit of movement for the thumb. The next group of muscles is the hypothenar muscles. Now, this group of muscles is the muscles that are around the fifth digit or the little finger. Their actions are going to help with movement of the fifth digit, the fifth phalange. And the third group is going to be the muscles that are in the palm of the hand. Again, there are several different muscles in here, but their main action is to help with movement of the fingers. So the midpalmar muscles. Midpalmar, right in the middle of the palm. So our three groups are the thenar muscles, the midpalmar muscles, and the hypothenar muscles.